My name is Daniel Hale. I'm 51 years old. For most of my life, I built quietly, never chasing applause, never needing to prove myself. I started as a civil engineer, working day and night on projects that shaped entire cities. Somewhere in the middle of all that progress, I bought a modest plot of land on the coast. Over the years, it became my sanctuary, a villa by the sea built brick by brick with my own hands. My wife Claire knew how much it meant to me, or at least I thought she did. The cracks in our marriage weren't loud. They were subtle, missed eye contact, passive jabs, her growing obsession with appearances and social status. Claire's family never liked how reserved I was. Her younger brother Marcus, especially, always looked down on me for not being ambitious enough, though he couldn't hold a job longer than 6 months. Still, I kept the peace. I let their smug little comments pass like wind. I had no interest in small battles. My life was bigger than their opinions. One afternoon, I came home from a short work trip and found Claire sitting in the living room, holding a wine glass like she was preparing for a performance. She didn't flinch, she didn't soften. She just said, "I've decided to let Marcus and his family move into the villa. It's wasted on you, you're always away. They need it more." I stood there, silent. My blood ran cold, but not with rage, with clarity. She had already packed some of my belongings. She had already called a moving company. It wasn't a discussion, it was a verdict. And then she said something I will never forget. "This is theirs now. You are not allowed to come." No hesitation, no kindness, just the steel of entitlement in her voice. I didn't argue. I didn't scream. I just looked at her, really looked, and saw, maybe for the first time, the depth of her disrespect. She wasn't doing this out of love for her brother. She was doing it because she believed I was powerless to stop her. I smiled. Just barely. Then I nodded. "All right," I said, my voice so calm it startled even her. "If that's what you've decided." And I walked out without another word. She believed that was the end of it. She thought she had claimed her prize, handed it off to her ungrateful family, and pushed me into the shadows of my own life. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that she had just walked onto a chessboard I'd been designing for years. Because I may not be flashy, I may not raise my voice or make scenes, but I own everything, and not just the villa. I own the land, the rights, the contracts, the legal walls that would close in slowly, silently, and completely, and the game was only just beginning. I sat in my car that evening, parked just a few blocks from the villa, and stared at the horizon until the sun dipped beneath it. The air smelled like salt and old pine, and for a moment it reminded me why I built that place in the first place. Not for show, not for anyone else. I built it for peace. The kind you have to earn after years of noise, and yet somehow I had let someone into my life who didn't understand the value of that peace. Someone who thought she could simply take what wasn't hers. As the days passed, I didn't reach out. I didn't call, didn't confront. I let Claire move in her narrative. I heard from a mutual friend that she had already told her family I had given up the villa because I couldn't keep up anymore. That lie was her cover story, and they ate it up. Her brother Marcus and his wife started planning renovations, oblivious to the fact that they were planting roots in sand that would soon dissolve beneath them. It's strange how betrayal doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers, sometimes it's a slow drip. A missed thank you, a redirected gaze, a decision made without you. I looked back at all the times I chose Claire over my instincts. I remembered when Marcus asked for a loan, and I gave it, knowing full well he wouldn't repay it. I remembered birthdays I organized, events I funded, bills I covered, not because I wanted something in return, but because loyalty was stitched into me. I never expected it to become a weapon they'd turn against me. And yet, there I was, cast out like I was the intruder, as if my history could be erased with a smirk and a wineglass. I kept remembering Claire's eyes when she told me I wasn't allowed to come back. There was no hesitation, no flicker of guilt, only calculation. She believed I'd built my legacy, but that I was too soft to defend it. She mistook my silence for surrender. That was her greatest miscalculation. Because the man she thought she'd outmaneuver wasn't idle. I wasn't broken or lost. I was thinking, planning, watching. I knew every nail in that villa. I knew every clause in the land deed, every permit, every legal loop that tied that property to me and only me. What she thought was an emotional decision on her part had legal consequences. And I had quietly protected myself years ago, knowing that people change and love, if not guarded, can rot into entitlement. But still, before I acted, I needed to understand how deep this betrayal went. Was this just about the villa, or had Claire been planning something much larger? The more I thought about it, the more I realized people like her don't just wake up one day and commit treason. It builds, it festers. And I was about to trace it back to the root. I returned to the villa early one morning, not to cause a scene, but to watch. I parked a few blocks away and observed from a quiet distance as movers carried furniture inside. Not mine, of course. Mine had already been removed, sold or stored without a word. Claire and Marcus laughed on the porch like it had always belonged to them. It was surreal. They were playing house, on soil they didn't realize was guarded by legal landmines. That afternoon, I met with my attorney, an old friend named Victor who had helped me draft the property documents years ago. He smiled when I explained the situation, then pulled out a thick folder from his archive. "They really don't read anything, do they?" he said, sliding the ownership papers across the desk. My name sat boldly on every title, the land, the structure. Even the access road was registered under a private maintenance agreement I controlled. Claire hadn't even bothered to check. She assumed marriage meant entitlement. She never expected foresight. But I wasn't going to make this about confrontation. I wanted something cleaner, quieter, and more permanent. I requested a temporary cease and desist be filed with the county registrar, something that would block any utilities or construction activity under unauthorized names. Then, I instructed Victor to draft a formal notice of trespass, not to be served immediately, but to hold in wait. I wanted them to feel comfortable, to make themselves at home, to invest. Because the deeper the roots they planted, the more painful it would be when I pulled them up. Over the next few days, I dug deeper into our joint finances. I discovered that Claire had made several transfers in recent months, rerouting funds from a joint investment portfolio into a shell account under her name. She thought she was clever. What she didn't know was that years ago, I had set alerts for any unusual movement in our shared assets. Quietly, I gathered documentation, working with my bank and a private investigator to trace every penny. The investigator uncovered more than I expected. It wasn't just the villa. Claire had been preparing for a financial separation, moving assets, aligning with her brother, even exploring overseas investments in her name alone, all while playing the role of wife to a man she had already decided was obsolete. It wasn't anger I felt, it was disappointment, not just in her, but in myself, for ignoring the warning signs. But now I had clarity, and clarity is power. I wasn't planning a show. No yelling, no revenge fantasy. This was going to be precise. Like clockwork, Claire and Marcus had assumed they were dealing with a man who wouldn't fight back. But what they were about to learn, and what I already knew, was that I didn't need to fight. I only needed to remove the ground from beneath their feet, one silent step at a time. The first signal came quietly. One morning, Claire called the electric company after the villa lost power. The technician politely informed her that due to a property ownership dispute, all utility services were suspended until further notice. I watched the confusion on her face from a distance. She stood in the driveway, phone pressed to her ear, gesturing wildly while Marcus paced behind her. They hadn't received any warning, not yet, but the cracks were forming, and they were spreading fast. Next came the letter, the formal notice of trespass, sealed and delivered to both Claire and Marcus. It was carefully worded, strictly professional, and backed by the full weight of my legal ownership. It didn't accuse, it didn't beg, it simply stated the truth. They were not authorized occupants, and they had 10 days to vacate the premises or face court proceedings. No drama, no spectacle, just a quiet reckoning, delivered with undeniable authority. Marcus tried to call me. Twice. I let it ring. Then Claire texted, not with apologies, but with veiled threats about how this would look to our social circle. That's when I realized something. They were less concerned with justice and more with image. The villa had become their status symbol, their shortcut to appearing successful without having earned any of it. That made their collapse all the more inevitable, and all the more satisfying to watch from afar. I kept every response short and polite. Please direct any communication through legal counsel. That was it. No emotion. No explanations. My silence unsettled them more than shouting ever could. Without electricity, without legal footing, and with mounting pressure, they scrambled to stabilize. But it was too late. Word began to spread that the villa they were so proud of wasn't theirs. A few neighbors asked questions. Some backed away. Their reputation already shallow began to crack. Then came the audit. Remember those financial transfers? Claire thought I wouldn't notice. I had filed a report with our bank, and they initiated a formal review. Her accounts were flagged. The shell investments frozen. Suddenly, the money she thought was hers alone was tangled in a legal web she didn't understand, because she never took the time to read, to ask, or to respect the man who built it all. That's when the panic set in. I wasn't watching to gloat. I was watching to confirm that justice was moving, slowly, methodically, without needing a single raised voice. They had invaded a space built from decades of labor and love, and they were learning that some legacies can't be stolen. They must be earned, and they never had. I drove by the villa one last time before the deadline expired. The windows were dark. The laughter that once spilled from the patio was gone. Claire stood outside, pacing with her phone clutched tightly in her hand, her voice low and strained. Marcus wasn't there. I would later learn he had already returned to the city, blaming her for the mess and distancing himself the moment things got complicated. It was poetic, really. The very person she gave everything for was the first to abandon her when the floor started to crumble. The eviction notice was executed without a hitch. Victor coordinated it all. A team arrived, accompanied by a quiet but firm officer, and Claire was asked to leave. No drama, no tears. Just the dull reality of consequence settling in. She tried to delay, of course. Claimed there had been a mistake, but the documents were in order. The signatures were all hers. The ignorance, all hers too. The very man she had dismissed as passive had just taken back everything without ever raising his voice. A few days later, I received a long email from Claire. It was full of half regrets, of justifications cloaked in faux remorse. She said things like I was under pressure, and I thought you'd moved on. But what struck me wasn't what she said, it was what she didn't say. There was no acknowledgement of the betrayal, no apology for stripping me of something sacred, just an aching awareness that she had miscalculated, not just legally, but morally, And now she stood in the ruins of her own scheme. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. She would never understand the years I spent building a life that didn't rely on noise. She would never value the quiet strength of a man who protected himself with foresight instead of vengeance. I had no desire to argue. The truth had spoken loud enough through the collapse of her plan, the freezing of her accounts, the whispers among those she once tried to impress. Reputation is fragile when built on stolen ground. The villa remained untouched for weeks after that. I had the locks changed, the grounds cleaned. Slowly I walked through each room again, alone, running my hand along the walls, touching memories she had tried to erase. There was peace now, a deeper kind than I'd ever known. Not because I'd won, but because I hadn't lost myself in the process. I had chosen silence over spectacle, dignity over reaction. And in doing so I had reclaimed more than just property. I had reclaimed my power. Some people think strength is loud, but the truth is, the most devastating strength is often invisible. It's the kind that moves slowly, without warning, until it's undeniable. Claire thought I was weak because I didn't argue. But what she never understood is that real power doesn't need to shout. It waits, it watches, and when the time is right, it acts with precision. I didn't tell anyone I had moved back into the villa. I didn't host a dinner. I didn't post pictures. I just returned, quietly. The echo of my own footsteps on the stone floors was the only welcome I needed. I poured myself a coffee and sat on the patio, watching the tide move in and out. Everything that had been touched by betrayal had now been reclaimed. Not just the property, but the peace that it once represented. I redecorated slowly, not out of necessity, but out of reverence. I chose new furniture, added personal touches that reflected who I had become, not who I used to be with her. There was something sacred about re-inhabiting a space after it's been violated, like cleansing a wound, not with rage, but with clarity. Every choice I made inside those walls reminded me that I was no longer a man hoping to be respected. I was a man who now demanded it by how he lived. Claire eventually stopped trying to reach out. I think she realized that some bridges once burned are better left in ashes. Marcus vanished into his usual pattern, another scheme, another bankruptcy, another victim. Their story unraveled without my involvement. I wasn't interested in watching anymore. I had other things to rebuild, not because I was broken, but because I had been released from the weight of pretense. Friends who once stayed neutral during the ordeal began reaching out again. Some apologized. Some just wanted to check in. I answered few of them. I wasn't angry, just evolved. When you've spent years being overlooked and underestimated, silence becomes your sharpest ally. I didn't need validation. I didn't need anyone to know what I had done. I only needed to keep walking forward with integrity. One morning, I received a letter from Claire's cousin, someone I always liked, who had been distant during the chaos. Her words surprised me. She wrote, "You taught me something. You didn't scream, and yet you were heard." I never realized silence could be that loud. That sentence stayed with me, because she was right. Some lessons don't require a lecture. They just need to be lived with such strength that others can feel the shift. The villa was mine again, but more importantly, I was mine again. I had spent so many years compromising out of love, out of hope, out of habit, that I had forgotten what it felt like to stand completely in my own power, and now, without noise, without vengeance, I had done exactly that. Life has a way of testing you not through storms, but through silence. It's in those moments when no one is watching, when the applause has faded, when the fight is over, that you discover who you really are. After everything, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt clean. There's a difference. I didn't want revenge. I wanted restoration. And that's what I'd built, not just brick and mortar, but dignity and peace that couldn't be stolen. A month after the dust had settled, I received a call from my former business partner, Edgar. We hadn't spoken in years, not since Claire's influence began pulling me into social circles I didn't belong in. Edgar had heard what happened. "You handled it like a surgeon," he said. "Most men would have burned everything down." I smiled. He wasn't wrong, but I had learned early in life that power without control is just destruction in disguise. He invited me to rejoin a project we once dreamed about, a sustainable housing initiative in a developing region we discussed years ago before life got complicated. I said yes, not for the money, not for recognition, but because it felt pure, a return to something real. I had stripped away so much illusion over the past year, the fake relationships, the empty obligations, the people who only came around when it suited them. I was ready to build again, but this time only with substance. As I prepared to leave for our first site visit, I walked through the villa one last time, running my hand along the newly painted walls, not to say goodbye, but to remind myself that I could come back any time, that I had nothing to prove. This home wasn't a trophy, it was a symbol of quiet survival, a reminder that even when people try to write you out of your own story, you can reclaim the pen, not with fury, but with strategy. I left a journal on the bookshelf near the entryway. Inside, I wrote the full account of what had happened, not out of bitterness but to preserve the truth, not for Claire, not for Marcus, for myself, in case I ever doubted again, in case I ever forgot the cost of ignoring your instincts, of downplaying your worth, of letting someone else define what you've built. Some truths need to be written down, so you never rewrite them out of sentiment. I locked the door, took a deep breath, and stepped into the sunlight. There was no music playing, no one cheering. Just me, the ocean breeze, and the sound of my own soul saying, "You did what most wouldn't. You waited, and you won." The work Edgar and I embarked on wasn't glamorous. It wasn't featured in magazines or splashed across social feeds. It was slow, purposeful, raw. We traveled to rural towns, met families who had nothing but soil beneath their feet and hope in their eyes. And somehow it felt more meaningful than anything I'd done in the last decade. There was something holy about building for people who needed shelter, not status. Each day brought me deeper into myself, without Claire's voice echoing in my head, without the pressure to perform for people who never truly saw me. I could finally hear my own thoughts again, and they were clear, focused, grateful. I had learned that survival isn't just about overcoming pain, it's about not letting it turn you into someone you're not. I had survived with my character intact. That was the quiet victory. One afternoon, while reviewing a site layout, I received a text from a number I didn't recognize. It was from Marcus's wife. Just 4 words, "She's lost everything now." I didn't reply. I didn't need to. Life has a way of restoring balance, with or without your permission. I wasn't interested in their ruin. I didn't need them to fall in order for me to rise. I had already climbed out of the wreckage, and I wasn't looking back. A week later, I stood before a small community as we broke ground on a new housing site. Children laughed in the background. Their mothers wept softly as we explained that the land had been donated, and the homes would be theirs within the year. That's when it hit me. I wasn't just reclaiming my own story, I was helping others write new ones. This was redemption, not as a concept, but as a practice, brick by brick, soul by soul. At night, I'd sit beneath the stars far from the villa and feel no ache for it. Not because it didn't matter, but because it no longer owned me. I had taken the pain it represented and turned it into purpose. I had taken the betrayal and turned it into blueprints. That was the true revenge, not the legal documents. Not the frozen accounts, but the quiet knowing that I had become better because of what was meant to break me. And in that space, beneath the African sky, with the sound of hammers and hope rising behind me, I realized something. Peace isn't the absence of betrayal, it's the presence of meaning after betrayal. And I had found it. There's something sacred about being underestimated. It gives you the freedom to watch, to prepare, to become. Claire never saw me coming because she never really saw me at all. To her, I was steady, reliable, maybe even boring. She thought I lacked ambition because I wasn't chasing what she chased. Influence, image, control. But I was building something deeper. Not for display, but for endurance. That's why I survived. That's why I always would. I started documenting my journey, not to publish it, but to pass it on. Lessons wrapped in quiet moments. Warnings hidden in memory. I wrote about how real strength is invisible until it's tested. How sometimes the people closest to you are the ones who train you best. Not through love, but through betrayal. And how if you remain calm, if you move with wisdom instead of noise, you can reclaim more than they ever took. Claire, I later heard, moved in with a friend across town. Her accounts remained frozen through the investigation. Her family, once so eager to boast about her success, fell silent. Marcus distanced himself from the fallout, spinning a new story, as people like him always do. I didn't interfere. I had nothing more to say to either of them. They had taught me all they could, and I had graduated, quietly and completely. One day I returned briefly to the city for a meeting. As I left the building, I passed Claire on the sidewalk. She was thinner, paler. Her eyes flicked up and locked with mine. She opened her mouth, maybe to speak, but I just nodded politely and kept walking. Not out of cruelty, but because nothing needed to be said. She knew, and more importantly, I knew. She had taken her shot, and I had survived it. Not by blocking it, but by turning it into fuel. That moment closed the final door. Not with a bang, but with the soft click of peace. There's a power in being able to face someone who wronged you and feel nothing. No hate, no fire. Just distance, just truth. And truth, once it sets in, doesn't need validation. It simply is. Later that evening, I wrote down one sentence in my journal. They thought they buried me, but they didn't know I was a seed. It wasn't bitterness, it was clarity. I hadn't just returned to who I was, I had evolved into something greater, and they would never get close enough again to touch it. When people talk about healing, they often imagine something loud, a grand gesture, a confrontation, an emotional release. But real healing is subtle. It doesn't need to announce itself. It lives in the way you sleep at night, the way you breathe in silence, the way you don't react when someone brings up the past. That was where I found myself now, not just past the betrayal, but beyond it. The villa became something different in my mind. It wasn't a fortress anymore. It wasn't a trophy to defend. It was simply a home. A symbol of the man I had been and the man I had outgrown. I began considering selling it, not because I needed the money, but because I wanted someone else to build new memories there, someone honest, someone grateful. Some spaces, no matter how beautiful, aren't meant to be kept, they're meant to be released. Before putting it on the market, I hosted one quiet dinner, just me, Edgar, and a few friends who had stood the test of time. We didn't talk about Claire. We didn't need to. The conversation flowed easily, grounded in truth and mutual respect. As the sun set beyond the cliffs, I felt the chapter closing, not with sorrow, not with celebration, just with completion, the kind that comes when you know you've handled everything with grace. I later donated a portion of the proceeds from the villa to the housing initiative. It felt poetic. The very space that was used to hurt me would now be used to shelter others, to build homes for those who had none. That's the kind of revenge I believe in, not destruction, but redirection, turning what was meant to harm you into something that heals others. Claire took something from me, and I turned it into hope. In time, I heard whispers that she had tried to repair her reputation, to rewrite the story, that the truth doesn't need to shout to be remembered. It lingers. It reveals itself through action. I had never defended myself publicly. I didn't need to. The quiet man they once dismissed had let the facts speak louder than any accusation ever could. And as I stood on the new project site one morning, watching a mother and her child step into their finished home for the first time, I felt it deep in my chest, not vengeance, not pride, but peace. The kind you don't find by winning, the kind you earn by walking away with your soul still intact. The story, in the end, wasn't about a villa. It wasn't about betrayal, or legal battles, or who ended up with more. It was about identity. It was about the quiet war we all fight when someone tries to erase our worth. When the person we trusted most decides we're expendable, it's in those moments, not the loud ones, but the ones that happen behind closed doors, that we either crumble or rise. I didn't rise through rage. I rose by remembering who I was before the world told me to be quiet. I rose by letting my silence speak, by letting truth unfold on its own time, by showing that character doesn't flinch when tested. It sharpens. Claire never saw the version of me that came after her betrayal, because she didn't believe such a version could exist. But he did, and he was stronger, quieter, and far more dangerous than she ever imagined. To those who feel powerless after being betrayed, I need you to understand something. Your stillness is not weakness. Your silence is not surrender. When the world expects you to fall apart, staying calm becomes a declaration. And when you rise, not in fury but in wisdom, you become something they can't touch. You become untouchable, unshakable, and most of all, unforgettable. I no longer needed to tell this story to heal. I had already healed. But I chose to tell it so others could see the roadmap. Not to imitate my steps, but to recognize that they have power too, even when they feel overlooked. Even when someone they love tries to silence them, you don't have to fight fire with fire. You can fight it with patience, with strategy, with truth. The villa sold, the chapter ended, and I walked forward, not bitter, not bruised, but better, lighter, wiser. Every scar became a symbol of what I'd carried and overcome, and in the stillness of my new home, far away from the coast, I began again, not rebuilding, but reimagining. My name is Daniel Hale. I am 61 years old, and I am not defined by what was taken from me. I am defined by what I never let go of, my honor, my vision, and my peace. And that they could never steal.